It's undisputable that the Budokai Tenkaichi series is recognized as some of the best quality games in not only Dragon Ball Z, but the entirety of anime. But why exactly is that? Originally releasing 3 games in the mid-2000s, followed nearly 2 decades later by Sparking Zero, there's no argument that the Budokai Tenkaichi name is a cultural phenomenon, with the 3rd installment being widely accepted as the best anime game of all time. And as far as my opinion goes, there's no doubt about it. I thoroughly enjoyed each of these titles growing up. I mean, they are legitimately some of my fondest middle school memories. But the question is, we're playing them now in 2025, how do they hold up? And as an experienced gamer and adult who recognizes flaws, were they even great to begin with? And by the way, little tidbit, if you guys have already seen my original 3 Tenkaichi videos, I did add a good portion to the Tenkaichi 3 section here, so stick around for that. And otherwise, let's begin our journey into the iconic Budokai Tenkaichi Trilogy. As a lifelong Dragon Ball fan, I can honestly admit that there was no better feeling than popping in a fresh PS2 disc and playing the newest entry in the Budokai series for the very first time. And with the massive success of the initial 3 games, there was little doubt in my mind a 4th entry was well on the horizon. But imagine my shock when a Budokai 4 was never announced, and my initial hesitance surrounding the upcoming console game, Budokai Tenkaichi. Now, don't get it twisted. The release of any new DBZ game is great news in my book. But by this point in 2005, I'd already played my fair share of Dragon Ball games that failed to meet my expectations. And to make matters even worse, I almost didn't get a chance to play this iconic entry as a kid. You see, this game being rated T, and me being about 9 years old at the time of release, well, I have a story for you. I have a distinct memory of a man approaching my dear grandmother while she was preparing to purchase this game for me in Walmart. This man in question attempted to persuade her not to purchase this game because it was a terrible influence on society, and everyone surrounding Goku on the box art was a demon. What a fucking loser, dude. I mean, to be fair, there are 2 actual demons in that picture, and my boy Broly basically makes 3, but Trunks, come on, man. Anyway, enough story time. Let's get to the real reason why we're all here today. Aside from me making videos on every Dragon Ball game to ever exist, of course. After playing this game for the first time 20 years ago, that's freaking wild, I can remember thoroughly enjoying this game. Or at least I think I do. That being said, most reviews that I've seen on Budokai Tenkaichi, while not directly hating on the game altogether, seem to think of it as a rough start to the trilogy. Now, I'll be the first to say that this could be true, and I may very well be confusing this title with some of the later games in the trilogy. But regardless, I figured there was no better way to test my theory than to replay Budokai Tenkaichi in its entirety. And when starting up the game, I knew immediately why I used to love this game so much. That badass fucking intro, bro. Now, I don't typically cover game intros in my videos these days, but this, damn. Everything from the animation, the music, the choreography is just so seamless and different than anything I've seen prior with these types of games. It's just beautiful and stands the test of time in my memory above any other. It doesn't even come close. But although the intro animation is great, the next determining factor here is unsurprisingly story mode. And unfortunately, this is where I began to notice some of the game's flaws. The combat just feels a bit unpolished. Not that it's terrible or anything, but in comparison to Budokai 3 and the later games in the Tenkaichi trilogy, it just feels really off. Aside from basic movements and melee attacks, there is also way too much repetition in the super attacks. So much of the roster will have the exact same melee super with very little, if any, difference in the attacks animation. Not to mention the key supers are very similar much of the time, like Rapid Energy Blast or Full Power Energy Blast. Major characters will have these basic ass supers as their own techniques, and it just feels really wrong when there could have been so many other classic techniques utilized, especially given certain major characters like Vegeta or Super Saiyan 3 Goku will have Super Explosive Wave as their ultimate. I mean, sure, it does some significant damage, but That's just so damn boring, at least in my opinion. Of course, it goes without saying that there are still a plethora of unique techniques, and they do look nice, but truth be told, I much preferred Budokai 3's combats. To play devil's advocate though, this is probably due to the fact they had to completely rework the game's combat system, as opposed to just upgrading certain little things like in the previous games. I mean, although it carries the word Budokai over, it is a completely new game. And I mean, these games were dropping every year at the time, without fail. And I would imagine it being quite a daunting task, especially with this type of roster. And when I had the chance to think about it, Budokai 1 suffered from a lot of the same exact problems that were fixed in later entries, so maybe Tenkaichi 2 will surprise me. However, this rough start to the trilogy is somewhat justified due to the complete reworking of not only the combat system, but many areas in the gameplay. Although of course still featuring invisible walls, and I use that term very loosely. The player is provided with a much more expansive area to explore and fight your enemies, complete with destructible environments like giant mountains that you can fly through, or better yet, punch and kick your opponent into with sheer force alone. This feels badass, and the much larger areas give you that free roam feeling that makes it feel akin to a more realistic Dragon Ball experience. Upon breaking these structures, you may find a Dragon Ball, which is located somewhere in each terrain. After collecting all 7, you're able to wish for a limited number of additional items, like rare characters for your roster, a password function, and an additional story scenario, the True World Tournament. I do enjoy these because they usher in some what-if scenarios, only available in this particular entry, like a complete reimagining of the OG Dragon Ball Tournament, Frieza vs. Cooler, and playing as each Saiyan as they take on the Tyrant Frieza, which basically just consists of every Saiyan, and even the freaking Cybermen, completely washing Frieza. What a sight that is. Along with the typical sagas you'd expect to see, come movie villains like Bojack and Broly, and also villain-centric scenarios where you play as Frieza, Cell, and Boo, taking on the Z-Warriors one by one. I always enjoy when games throw in these little extra sagas like this, because it's so cool to see the villain's perspective of things. Something else that stood out to me, which isn't necessarily distinctly for this game in particular, is the differentiations in the battles that you'll undergo. For instance, as opposed to the game just being fight after fight, requiring you to defeat your enemy by sheer force each and every time, certain battles in this game will force you to navigate just a bit differently. Like finishing off an enemy with a specific special move that's relative to the canon, defeating an enemy in a set time frame, or most commonly, surviving until the time runs out. Now you would think these in particular would be quite easy, in fact the easiest of the bunch. But contrary to popular belief, I found these to be the most difficult stages in the game. Great Ape Vegeta was no freaking joke, and neither is Great Ape Gohan, and one of the very first freaking levels nonetheless. Not that the game was overly simple to begin with, but they really ramped up the difficulty in these stages, man. I found that the easiest way to secure a win in this scenario is to charge up a Ki Blast, which will knock back the enemy, giving you the time you need to recharge, and do it all over again until the clock strikes 0. Boring, tedious, yes, but it works. Another key differentiation in the story mode is, well, the format of the story mode itself. Each saga or scenario is uniquely separated into an episodic-like format, almost like chapters with ends and beginnings. Along with the obvious progression from stage to stage, in correlation with the canon timeline of DBZ, you will have the option to scroll downwards, giving you the opportunity to take on optional battles for 100% completion. In these situations, you'll typically face off against the same villain, but with a different character, most commonly utilized when facing off against characters like the Cybermen, Cell Juniors, or of course, when the whole gang tries to take on Frieza. And all in all, I really did enjoy the format of this. I thought it was super unique, and it also just feels really organized. It just made the scenarios feel that much more rewarding to 100% complete. Completing stages in story mode will also unlock new characters for your roster, typically occurring once you finally defeat said villain for the final freaking time. Along with character unlocks, you'll get Z items, which can be used to customize your character's stats, like increasing their attack power and defense, in other modes such as Ultimate Battle. Now, I had been looking everywhere for this mode for quite some freaking time, specifically when I played Tenkaichi 3 because I had assumed that was where I remembered it from, but I was so happy that I finally found it here. Something about this mode is so cool to me. choosing your favorite character, upgrading them with your collected items, and then fighting through 100 enemies to reach that coveted #1 spot, with each enemy becoming progressively more and more difficult to overcome. On your journey to the top, you'll collect points, which increase upon every single win, and decrease in the instance that you're defeated. Occasionally, you'll also have the option to take on a more challenging opponent, sort of equivalent to when Super Smash Bros. Says new challenger approaching. Only difference here is you don't unlock a new fighter, but you will advance several ranks upwards upon your win. And given there's 100 fighters, just take the freaking risk. Next, it goes without saying that one of my favorite modes of all time returns in Tenkaichi. The World Tournament. Now, I've talked about this mode in depth in about every DBZ game I've covered. There's not really much difference here to justify a full section. Just trust me, it was a great time. A couple things to note though is that you will unlock new tournament difficulties by completing the initial ones. For instance, beating Novice unlocks Adept, being Adept unlocks Advance, and so on, with each rise in difficulty adding more fighters to the tournament. However, I found it excessively easy to sort of cheese the game here for a ring out, by either firing off powered up ki blasts a few times, or my absolute favorites, utilizing Goku's Dragon Throw. Some of the more difficult opponents may give you a tough time with the initial grab, but trust me, this shit works every time flawlessly. Like, if this was a newer game, that shit would get patched day 2, bro. You also, of course, have the obvious modes like dueling and training, options, and character encyclopedia, which showcases every character and transformation the game has to offer, complete with a lengthy bio for each and every one of them, if you're into that sort of thing. The one thing that did catch me quite off guard with the new mode selection is that, well, there's no shop here. Instead, you can do something called Z Item Fusion, which will not only allow you to create better Z items for your character to gain higher tier stat boosts, but unlocks the remainder of the roster when matched with the appropriate purple Pataras. Sounds kind of tedious, and it can be, but I, for some reason, had a really fun time doing this. But before we do go, let's give a brief analysis of the good, the bad, and the ugly of DBZ Budokai Tenkaichi 1. Now, I want to start off this outro by saying I had a really fun time playing through this game again. It brought back so many memories, seeing that unique story mode, the incredible opening cutscene, which I can get freaking Joe Biden level dementia and never forget. And of course, the character selection is top tier when compared to the previous games. However, that increase in the roster is likely what caused this game to not reach its full potential. So many of the fighters have the exact same combos, super and ultimate attacks, and even the ones that are unique just don't look that great, in my opinion. But maybe I'm just spoiled with the newer DBZ games, man, I don't know. Regardless, you can tell that this is kind of a prototype to what Tenkaichi 2 and 3 would become in the following years. And man, I am super excited to jump into Tenkaichi 2 next, so make sure to stick around for that. But to actually wrap things up here, if I had to give an honest score from 1 to 10, I think I'd give Dragonball Z Budokai Tenkaichi an honest 7.1. I mean, really, I wanted to go 6.9, but this game is too nostalgic for me to go below 7. After the release of Budokai Tenkaichi, fans were left to speculate what would come next to follow up this monumental title. And the answer we got was the release of perhaps the most underrated Dragon Ball game of all time, Budokai Tenkaichi 2. Now, I'll be the first to admit, while I didn't dislike the original Budokai Tenkaichi, I was a bit skeptical on whether this sequel would deliver on all of its promises. I mean, 129 characters covering the entirety of the DBZ and GT storyline? That feat seemed a bit far-fetched, even to me as a kid. Reason being, while the original Tenkaichi did expand the core roster and also brought in some new characters that we hadn't seen in the original Budokai trilogy, aside from appearance, the differences in gameplay between each of the characters was few and far between, especially for the transformations. However, once I finally started my playthrough of this underrated entry, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, mind you, I realized just how overlooked this game was in comparison to its slightly younger brother, Budokai Tenkaichi 3. And where better to begin what might become one of my favorite retrospectives of all time than story mode, Dragon adventure. From as early as the first hour of my playthrough, I realized that this very well may be the most thorough rendition of Dragon Ball Z story that I've ever played, at least as far as the battle aspects go. The improvements here are monumental, to say the least. The sagas themselves take hours to get through, jam-packed with a plethora of content. Literally, every fight imaginable is included here. I'm not kidding. If Goku fights an enemy in the anime, then let's say he goes Super Saiyan halfway through the battle, as he's prone to do, well, that's another fight against the same exact enemy that you just fought. Vegeta fights a villain, and then the next battle, Vegeta slightly changes locations and fights the exact same villain again. That's 2 fights in a row fighting the same exact dude with the same exact form. I just know the devs took their time rewatching this entire series, and every new fight that occurred, no matter how insignificant or small, they were like, okay, that's a battle. Write that shit down. Another great inclusion in this game's story mode is the ability to fly freely across the continental Dragon Ball world, taking Dragon Adventure to new heights, literally. Taking notes from Budokai 3, Tenkaichi 2 allows the player to not only fly from battle to battle, giving you an even more thorough experience of the story, but also gives you the option to stop at other iconic locations along the way. And while Budokai 3 did have this implementation in that story mode, you were still unable to actually roam around these locations once landing. Instead, simply delivering a quick text-based dialogue or granting you an item real quick. However, in this entry, albeit not very far, we were able to explore these areas and interact with the cast that was found there at our leisure. During your visit, you may also come across Z items, money, Dragon Balls, and even enemies to spar with, further increasing your character's level and preparing you for the next main event. And some of these stages, well, you may actually need to prepare yourself for, because Tenkaichi 2 can actually get pretty difficult. And while this game does offer you the choice between different difficulties, at least for the story mode, even the normal difficulty is a quite daunting task at times, which is where the level system I mentioned comes into play. In RPG fashion, you're able to level up each respective character by completing battles. Again, drawing even more similarities to Budokai 3. You're also going to want to take advantage of the Z items that you come across, because they will not only grant you additional stat boosts like higher health, attack, and defense, but also increase your character's level based on the item utilized. Equipping these, along with other skill-based Z items, will make upcoming challenges a bit more manageable, especially when it comes to one of the 3 special battles in the game, which happen to be just another reason why I fucking love Budokai Tenkaichi 2. You'll notice that most fights will require you to win the battle, regardless if the character actually won that fight in the anime. But in these 3 special scenarios I mentioned, including a fight against Raditz, Dodoria, and Adult Gohan, you are not required to win. Initially, I had no idea that winning these battles would actually unlock secret scenarios, but still, you knew damn well I was not about to let Dodoria get the best of me. However, Dodoria and the other 2 did, many fucking times. These bouts are tough, rightfully so, which drew my suspicion even more so on what the drastic change in difficulty was for. Anyway, completing these battles unlocks complete and quite lengthy what-if scenarios, including a story where Raditz loses his memory and becomes a good guy, for a brief period. Zarbon attempting to overthrow Frieza and his goons and obtain eternal beauty, which was probably bro's headcanon the entire time. And also a complete reimagining of the Majin Buu saga, which honestly has way too many Goku vs Vegeta fights, which unfortunately brings me to some of my dislikes of Tenkaichi 2. Yes, there are some bad things. Don't get me wrong, while it is awesome that we get such an in-depth rendition of the Z story and GT, in the movies, sometimes it gets to be a bit too much. For instance, first Goku fights Vegeta in the tournaments. Okay, bet. Now we're moving locations to repeat the exact same fight, or even better, Goku versus Janemba in base, fully capable of turning Super Saiyan 3 mid-battle. But still, we have to fight the same version of Janemba, but this time starting as Super Saiyan 3. Even the movies, What If stories, and GT are covered in such excruciating detail, and for the stages, I mean, they are vastly improved upon here, at least in comparison to the previous game. Not only are we treated to a much better variety of, and some great looking stages at that, but fighting mid-air, on ground, and even underwater looks so much better. And the Dragon Balls found in these stages also give you more rewards than just characters, such as skills that are super useful, stat boosts, and items you can sell for high prices to get the same stat boosts. I mean, at least pretty much. However, while these stages are vastly improved, let's not forget this is the section where we're talking shit. And let me tell you, they leave out some key stages here, at least in terms of the story that they're attempting to cover. In the Fusion Reborn storyline, hell isn't available, which is like the premise of the entire movie. So the Z Fighters battle Janemba on the lookout, which is pretty much the opposite of hell. So, the fuck? And on top of that, you also fight Pycon in the Earth's World Tournament instead of the other world. Which, I mean, I get how adding all these stages could be troublesome. The game can only be so big, and they do cover a lot of ground here. But if you're going to try and tell the entirety of the story in such depth like this, you gotta at least add HFIL, man. Come on. And don't get me started on that damn ruined city. Now I know cities be getting ruined pretty frequently in DBZ, but damn, they use that same stage over and over and over again anytime a fight takes place with a building in a 100-mile radius. I got so sick of seeing that stage, bro. And again, these are just some of many examples I could give you, but trust me, it gets really tedious and seems completely unnecessary at times. Although I will say it put a smile on my face to see them giving almost all of the OG movies and GT such good attention. So much so that the roster is massively improved upon since the original game, and not only in terms of numbers. For starters, the combat here is much more complex. Everything from basic melee attacks to supers receive a massive upgrade, and the supers actually feel relative to the characters and their transformations. Although I gotta say, having a full GT story and not having GT Goku and GT Vegeta felt pretty weird. I couldn't find a better place to throw that in, but anyway, back to the positives. The cast actually have more diverse moves now. In contrast to Tenkaichi 1, the rush melees are different between most characters, and even the ones who have that basic high-speed rush typically still have their own little twist on it. And an even bigger plus, they don't have that stupid background going on, which makes it look so much more clean in comparison. Also, you're able to tag in a member of your team at many times during the story, applying to situations where many of the Z fighters took on an enemy at one time. This is so much more efficient than having each of the fighters take on the enemies one at a time like the OG Tenkaichi did, and also helps the story flow way better. And damn, we need that because this game is already long enough. Your entire party will also gain experience points upon completion of a fight, which I found to be really cool. The teleporting, vanishes, and combo chains are so fluid. They feel seamless, and again, the supers look so much more clean too. Almost like this is the real Tenkaichi 1, and the actual Tenkaichi 1 was like a test version or something. Ultimate attacks can also completely alter the landscape, giving you a destroyed version of Earth or Namek, which looks so damn sick. Especially the brief cutscene of the exploding planet upon impact. Speaking of the cutscenes, we've got some positives and negatives here. The negatives being, well, there certainly aren't many cutscenes at all. Most of the time, the dialogue between battles is text with some voiceovers, which drags on and on and on. And I only found this slightly intriguing during the what if battles because, well, I hadn't seen them before, or at least in like 19 years, so it was actually cool to experience that story. The positives, well, the few cutscenes they actually do have, which again are very infrequent and kind of random. Like you'd expect there to be some for some certain battles, and there's just not. But I digress. The ones that do exist are pretty well made for their era and lengthy as well, covering some cool ass fight scenes that actually captured my attention and intrigue, like that badass Goku vs Vegeta scene at the end of the Saiyan arc. Also, the cutscene for the defeat of Kid Buu gave me chills. Like for some reason, this style is almost better than those super high quality fancy ones. Nothing tops the OG Tenkaichi intro though, I'll give it that. Once you finally complete Dragon Adventure, if you're as patient as I am, you'll have a vast majority of the characters unlocked, as well as skills and Z-item fusions, which make a return in this game as well, allowing you to unlock quote-unquote secret characters, and upgrade some Z-items as well. Again, another returning element is Ultimate Battle, which has evolved from being a fight your way to the top out of 100 enemies, to fight your way to the top out of 7 or 8 or 5 enemies. In all seriousness, it does feel a bit more organized this way, separating each of the Ultimate Battles into separate scenarios, like Kakarot Road, which is actually based on the main antagonists Goku goes up against, in order, starting with the OG Dragon Ball Yamcha fight, through the final showdown with Kid Buu, even featuring a secret battle against Oob upon completion. Once beating Kakarot Road, you'll unlock other courses like the Ginyu Force course, which entails you going up against all of the Force's members at once. Kind of like that one stage in Sparking Zero. If you know, you know. And similar to the previous Ultimate Battle, you will gain points as you progress, and each of the succeeding opponents will become more of a challenge. You'll also gain additional points based on oddly specific criteria as well. I will say, while this mode does feel a bit more organized, I do prefer the OG Ultimate Battle a bit more. The concept of fighting your way to the top out of 100 players just feels so much more interesting and fun to me. Next, of course, my all-time favorite mode, the World Tournament, returns. Again, I won't say too much about this. You can check my previous Budokai and Tenkaichi videos for all that, but it returns in similar fashion to the previous entries. This time around, the tournament is separated into 3 categories and numerous difficulties, leading to you winning Zenny upon the completion of each. Beyond that, you can also, of course, utilize dueling and training modes. Dueling allowing you to access all the stages in the game. But before we do wrap this up, let's break it down and discuss our overall opinion on Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2. Now, upon beginning this entry, I figured I'd enjoy it more than the OG Tenkaichi, but I had no idea just how much. That's because the combat is drastically updated, to the point where it makes the original Budokai Tenkaichi look more like a test demo than the first entry in a trilogy. The supers and the ultimates are more akin to the characters they represent as well. And the rush attacks, differentiations, and the combos make it feel so much more diverse and complete of a game as well. The story mode being extremely lengthy does take some patience to get through. Trust me, it's not easy, especially doing it all at once. And that's because the fights are repetitious as hell. Stages are kind of lacking in some departments given what they're trying to cover, and if you're playing on advanced difficulty like I attempted to for some of the content, you're in for a ride. I'll just be the first to tell you that. Again, it is really cool that they went this in depth with all the minor and major fights in the series, more so than just about any Dragon Ball game that I've ever had the pleasure of experiencing. It's just quite a remarkable feat in general, and if you're going to fit all of this content into one game, I mean, it's really difficult to do, and they did an okay job at it. We gotta give them that. And I forgot to mention earlier in the video that if you collect all the Dragon Balls on Namek, you summon Purunga, and you get 3 wishes instead of 1, which is cracked, bro. Definitely just fly to Namek, or just choose a Namek stage once you fucking collect. Just choose a Namek stage once you collect all 7 Dragon Balls, and that's just, if you're trying to collect all the Z items, bro, that's the way to go. Very canon accurate. All in all, even with the game's flaws that it does have, this is definitely one that you don't want to miss, and absolutely one of my favorite Dragon Ball Z games of all time. I'm not just saying that, it's actually so good. Trust me, it's definitely worth the replay if you hadn't picked it up in a while like myself. Also, I gotta say, in some aspects, and don't roast me for this, guys, everyone's entitled to their opinion. In some aspects, not all, in some aspects, Tenkaichi 2 is better than Tenkaichi 3, and maybe one of the best Dragon Ball games to ever hit the market. For that reason, I'm giving Budokai Tenkaichi 2 a 9 out of 10. Which is super high for my rankings. Over the past 2 decades or so, fans have praised Budokai Tenkaichi 3 for its gameplay and its impressive roster, with many hailing it as the best DBZ game of all time. But with the release of the newest entry in the franchise, Sparking Zero, I wondered how well does Budokai Tenkaichi 3 hold up in comparison to its younger brother? Of course, it's to be expected. When a new game from the same series releases, there is to be updates, improvements made upon its predecessor, especially when the game in question was released 17 years later. Still, from my personal experience, many of the old school Dragon Ball games bring something to the table that the current generation just simply cannot replicate. So I thought we'd put my little theory to a test, to see not only if Sparking Zero is the pinnacle of Dragon Ball gaming, but to see if Tenkaichi 3 still holds up, comparisons between the two titans, including my opinion on which is the superior game, and of course, the ins and outs of Tenkaichi 3 as a whole. Now, when starting off, you'll initially notice that the main menu screen, while being very presentable, does not hold a damn candle to that of Sparking Zero, which, in all honesty, is to be expected for an old school anime game. However, one factor that bothers me, at least a tad bit, is that there's far too many unnecessary game modes. For instance, certain options here, like, let's say, Character Encyclopedia, could have easily been put together with other non-battle centric modes and a more presentable extras mode or something of that sort. However, once you select story mode, that's when the game flourishes. The story here is separated neatly into distinct sagas, including ones you'd expect to see in any Dragon Ball title, like Saiyan, Frieza, Cell, and Boo. However, on your journey, you'll also unlock unique scenarios, which not only are absent from the game's successor, but some that are specific to this game entirely. Now, that's not to suggest, by any means, that Sparking Zero is lacking in this department. And if you've seen my videos, you know that I've previously praised that game for its ability to innovate and create a multitude of stories branching off the main campaign. What I'd really like to focus on here, though, is where Sparking Zero did end up falling short. And there's 3 specific sagas, we'll call them, in which I personally felt that it did. Firstly, and perhaps most apparently, OG Dragon Ball. One thing the newest Dragon Ball game lacked is not only Dragon Ball characters in general, but any real reference to the OG series whatsoever. In stark contrast, not only provides us with an, albeit brief, actual storyline for the Dragon Ball series, but a plethora of characters as well, some of which I had completely forgotten were in this game and was quite a welcome surprise to me. This includes the more obvious ones like General Tao and King Piccolo, but the game also brings in some very rare casts from Goku's origins, like General Blue, Nam, Hater, and perhaps the biggest surprise of all, freaking Devilman. That is so bizarre. Now, for some fans, particularly those who grew up with Super, it may feel a bit silly to play as these characters who are considered a bit weaker in comparison to the likes of End of Z Goku, Gogeta, or Omega Shenron. But for us OG fans, and I'm speaking on the ones who grew up with DBZ and Dragon Ball running simultaneously on Toonami, the good old days, man. Or perhaps even older fans who were aware of the series from its original Japanese run. If you fall into either one of those categories, then I know for a fact that this was an absolute treat. Sure, there's a good possibility that Sparking Zero will add more OG Dragon Ball characters to the mix in the form of DLC. And honestly, I really hope they do. But for now, and also a bonus, these characters are in the base game. That's a big point for Tenkaichi 3. The second saga in question, Dragon Ball GT. Now, to be fair, Sparking Zero does add a significant amount of GT characters to the mix, enough to at least warrant this, my personal opinion, being a controversial take. But regardless, I'm gonna stand on business. The fact that GT has its own story here is really cool, and I definitely appreciated playing through it because, let's be real guys, GT in itself isn't bad. I mean, those first 20 episodes or so, I mean, that's arguably pretty trash. There's some pretty solid battles and villains in the series as a whole, one of which, Super 17, makes his grand appearance here, and for some odd reason, not in Sparking Zero. Now, Super 17 is one of the 3 main villains in that entire series, so I did find his exclusion from Sparking Zero to be quite strange, and as many have pointed out, he's likely to be one of the first major candidates for a DLC release, but still, it is really weird he was excluded from the base game. The last saga that Tenkaichi 3 did better was the movies. Not only do they include some movie characters that aren't in Sparking Zero, like Base Form Garlic Jr. for instance, but there's an entire scenario for movie villains, played in order from Bardock vs. Frieza all the way through Hirudegarn. Some of these movies even consisting of 2 separate episodes, usually occurring when the good guys get stomped the fuck out by the likes of Broly or even Bojack, and you get the unique experience to relive some of these awesome moments in the game. It's worth pointing out that this also occurs in the main timeline timeline sagas, where a villain will unanimously win the battle, usually against a plethora of Z fighters. And in this scenario, you'll switch back and forth between them and the heroes. Some examples of this are when Frieza dominates the Z Warriors on Namek, and also when Cell does the exact same thing on Earth. Some might say I'm being a bit nitpicky here with the whole story mode and lack thereof, but I truly don't think that's the case. The devs here likely felt that they need to cut the OG and certain GT characters from the roster just to save room for the, of course, plethora of super characters that were introduced to the series in Sparking Zero. And although this is very valid, as it's new and they're very fun to play with, I do still wish they worked on finding a better middle ground here. But again, in this day and age, I guess that's what DLC is for. In contrast, Sparking Zero excels in taking the story of Dragon Ball to new heights, creating so many unique opportunities to deviate from the original and traditional Z and Super storylines, even introducing some brand new villains into the mix as allowed, like Gohan Black, which I thought was absolutely sick. This, in my opinion, is badass and kind of makes up for the fact they missed the mark on a lot of the original material. I mean, realistically, the base game can only be so big. If you do want to hear more of my takes on Sparking Zero as a whole, I made multiple videos on that game already, and I'll leave some of the links up here, somewhere up there. I'm not good at that. In terms of the overall roster though, it's a competitive landscape for sure. Again, as mentioned previously, Sparking Zero did remove many Dragon Ball, GT, and even certain versions of movie villains from the mix just due to the overwhelming amount of super characters that were introduced. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a worse game for that. It felt nothing short of refreshing, playing through the story of Super in Budokai/Tenkaichi format. And finally, utilizing those new characters who, in all reality, are a decade old at this point. For the first time in this environment, really made it feel like we were entering a new era in the Dragon Ball universe. However, while this is the case, in terms of each player's combat, many, and I mean many features are carried over. Like the plethora of unique forms certain characters have, which allow you to utilize different movesets, super attacks, and even ultimates. The DP formats, in which a player is allowed a maximum of 15 points per team to help restore some balance to the game and prevent players from using only the broken characters. Even the mechanics like teleporting behind an enemy as they attack or chain teleporting to enhance your combo. But at this point, many of you are probably thinking, duh, this is basically Budokai Tenkaichi 4. Not even basically, it literally is. I figured these similarities were still worth pointing out as the original Budokai trilogy had some stark differences in its combat between the three. But that being said, I still haven't played Budokai Tenkaichi 1 or 2 in years. And I mean, over a decade. So perhaps they did make some major improvements over that trilogy. And if that's the case and this video here does well, then we'll find out together. This relates to the Supers and Ultimates as well, as many of them are carried over from Tenkaichi 3 to Sparking Zero. However, the graphical upgrades and choreography make these slight differences feel so much more apparent, and something about that Sparking Zero moveset is just so top tier that without much question or thought, I have to give this one to Sparking Zero. I also felt it was worth briefly touching on the difficulty between the games. Now that being said, Dragon Ball games were never known, to me at least, for their difficulty. I mean, sure, in comparison to some other anime or even fighting games in general, Dragon Ball games may have a bit more of a challenge, at least in the past. But newer games like Kakarot felt so lacking in that department, especially prior to the DLCs. However, Tenkaichi 3 certainly does deliver in difficulty. I mean, normal mode is no joke. Omega Shenron threw my ass for a loop multiple times, and Kid Buu was not to be taken lightly. But still, when compared to the unexpected level of challenge found in Sparking Zero, overall at least, the difficulty just doesn't compare. Sparking Zero had so many battles that me and many other players felt were a little bit too difficult for their own good, to the point of nearly rage quitting without going back to easy mode, and I would never. And at least in Tenkaichi 3, Grade 8 Vegeta is a reasonable fight. Now, after playing through the initial two games, I have a bit of a better understanding why Budokai Tenkaichi 3 in particular became the cultural phenomenon that it did. That being said, I still hold my opinion that Budokai Tenkaichi 2 is an amazing title, and one that is a strong contender for the best Dragon Ball game of all time. But I also recognize that I may feel that way, mainly because I'm largely into the campaign side of games, while others may not feel that exact same way. And that being said, when it comes to story mode, Budokai Tenkaichi 2 does undisputably blow 3 out of the water. But I also can't ignore that the combat has definitely improved throughout the trilogy. Where BT1 felt like a test demo, BT2 felt like what Budokai Tenkaichi 1 could have been given a bit more time. BT3 feels like the natural evolution to that game. The gameplay in general feels more polished, with melees being so crisp and smooth. Supers and ultimates are plentiful and feel very appropriate for the characters in each of their forms. And the vanishes are just so fucking fun to pull off, especially when performed in a combo. Replaying this again for this video, I unlocked new characters I couldn't even dream of, like the fusion peel-off machine. I mean, I get playing as Yajirobe, but who in the world is gonna play as these guys? Also, having a more complete GT roster is a huge one for me. I thought it was so off-putting that in Budokai Tenkaichi 2, we played as Z Goku and Z Vegeta during that portion of the storyline, going as far as having adult Goku fighting Omega Shenron in the cutscene. But here, GT gets its final shine, having each transformation and version of GT Goku, as well as a separate character slot for GT Vegeta. All in all, the character selection and customization here is fantastic, offering tons of ways to spice up your favorites, from color changes to improved stats and Z items, expanding upon the implementation in the previous game. Each of the roster feels super distinct, and again, I love the different variations of certain characters based on the eras of the story, like early, mid, and end of Z Goku, for instance. Touching on the mode selection here, Ultimate Battle returns again, but with another new variation, allowing you to fight through pre-made battles with your own customized team. You'll gain points and get ranked based on performance at the end of each, which sort of reminds me of Custom Battle in Sparking Zero. Within Ultimate Battle, you can also find Battle Sim, which at first seemed kind of weird to me, but once I got the hang of it, it was pretty fun. You have 10 days, more like seconds, to train your character for the upcoming battle, choosing to train defense, offense, explore, rest, or eat a senzu bean in the process. Your actions during these 10 days reflecting directly on the amount of health, power, defense, and more of your character of choice when the battle arises. And while this was pretty unique, it definitely shows its age, and not something I'd go back to over and over again. I also think the 100 Fighter Ultimate Battle from Budokai Tenkaichi 1 is still the best version of this mode. World Tournament mode is majorly upgraded here as well, finally ditching the old format of Novice, Adept, Advanced, and having specific tournaments that have specific difficulties, like World Tournament being easy and Cell Games being hard, due to the fact that you have to carry over remaining HP from the previous fight. All in all, this World Tournament is very much aligned with how Sparking Zero structured its version. The key difference though is that these tournaments will only be available at certain times, noted by the timer on the main menu page for it. Beyond this, there's of course dueling, which allows you to select through all the stages available in the game. And let me tell you, these are improved as well, having a wider range in each and a much more expansive variety, my favorite of which being Muscle Tower. I love this in Budokai 2, and I sure as hell love it here. Also, there's of course training, options, and character encyclopedia available as well. But anyway guys, that's it for today's video. If you all did enjoy this long retrospective and you're still here, make sure to smash that like button, leave a comment below on which of these three is your favorite. It's probably gonna be Budokai Tenkaichi 3. If it is, let me know, and if it's not, let me know even more, because I wanna hear about why you like 1 or 2. If you guys haven't yet, make sure to smash that subscribe button. We're trying to hit 3K subscribers by the end of this year. Anyway guys, thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Peace.